In Brooklyn, the most dangerous place was not an alley. It was a familiar door that looked like every other door. If you stay for this story, you will see how an ordinary neighborhood can hide a system built to erase people without noise.
Subscribe now, because the details you miss in the first minute become the answers you need at the end.
The Gemini Lounge looked like a local hangout, but investigators would later call it the center of a long, hidden production line.
Roy DeMeo was not famous to the public then, and he was a working man face, and that is what made him useful.
In the late 70s and early 80s, New York swallowed missing people fast, and paperwork could hide what the streets could not explain. On January 10th, a discovery near Sheepshead Bay looked like another grim call, until patterns began to speak louder than any witness. A veteran homicide detective kept an unofficial ledger, not of headlines, but of repeating details the city treated as separate accidents.
The city was divided into boxes, and the truth lived between them, where no single report could see the whole shape.
Federal agents were watching for stolen cars and rackets, but what they started hearing suggested a darker inventory than vehicles.
The conversations sounded like business, like cleanup, like deliveries, and that was the point. Coded language that could hide anything. When local patterns met federal listening, the story stopped being about isolated deaths and started looking like an organized system. Systems require routine, and routine requires space, and the Gemini Lounge offered privacy, familiarity, and control. People arrived thinking they were settling debts, closing deals, or meeting friends, and the door closed behind them like a routine habit. Estimates later ranged from 75 to 200 victims, because the method was designed to prevent names from ever attaching to bodies. The most productive killers do not always look like nightmares. Sometimes they look like men with schedules, keys, and dinner plans. This was not a lone predator. It was a rotating crew, disciplined by profit, fear, and loyalty to a larger criminal structure. DeMeo's world treated murder like service work, priced, scheduled, delivered, and then wiped clean as if it never happened. When word finally surfaced, neighbors realized the threat was not distant. It was embedded in the same streets they called safe.
In 1983, forensic science could not do what we expect today, and the killers built their routine around that limitation.
The detective believed many scenes belonged to one source, not because of one clue, but because of repetition across years. Federal surveillance kept running, hour after hour, until the accumulation of small phrases began to sound like a method.
Agents noted people who walked in and did not appear to walk out, and the list grew quietly, like a calendar of vanishing.
Many victims lived on the margins, and when they disappeared, the city often assumed they chose to disappear. The crew operated under a larger family's shadow, which meant protection, resources, and a reason for outsiders to stay silent.
The core horror was not creativity, it was repetition. The same steps carried out until killing felt like shift work.
Brooklyn offered endless places to discard evidence: water, lots, construction, trash routes, and all of it moved faster than detectives could.
Resources were thin, murders were many, and the crew relied on that imbalance the way a thief relies on a crowd. DeMeo built income through stolen cars and rackets, and when violence solved problems faster, it became part of the business.
By 1982, his usefulness was matched by risk, and in that world, risk is handled the same way problems are handled.
DeMeo sensed distance from his own side. Meetings vanished, calls changed tone, and he began to move like a man expecting betrayal.
On the same day evidence surfaced by the bay, DeMeo himself would also be located, and the machine began to break apart.
Without the leader, loyalty cracked, fear shifted, and every man involved had to decide whether silence still protected them. The moment the crew lost its center, investigators gained time, and time is what patterns need to become proof. A key break came from an insider trying to save himself, and his story gave shape to what evidence could not say alone. A confession is not enough. It must point to verifiable facts, places, dates, people, and the crew had left faint traces. The insider described a routine: lure, isolate, kill, remove evidence, and it sounded less like rage and more like procedure. The point was not spectacle. The point was to leave nothing that could link a victim to a location, or a location to a crew.
When there is no body and no certainty, grief becomes suspended, and families live inside a question that never ends.
Prosecutors could not try every disappearance, so they chose cases with the strongest links, turning a vast horror into a finite argument. Once one insider talked, the crew faced a new math. Silence no longer guaranteed safety. It guaranteed exposure without control. The most corrosive force was not police pressure. It was suspicion inside the crew, every man wondering who would speak first. Rumors move faster than facts, but even rumors changed behavior. People avoided doors, meetings, handshakes that once felt normal.
People believed there were rules that protected outsiders, but this crew proved rules are stories, and stories do not stop bullets.
What looked like isolated events across a decade began to compress into one story, one location, one crew, one operational rhythm.
The central question is not how they killed. The central question is how they did it for years without the city seeing it as one thing.
It lasted because the city had too many crimes at once, and a well-run operation can hide inside noise like a needle in rain.
It lasted because water, landfills, and industrial emptiness made disposal anonymous, and anonymity is the oxygen of organized violence.
It lasted because many victims were people whose absence could be dismissed, criminals, drifters, debtors, and the city's sympathy was selective. And that is where the fear deepens, because sometimes the victim is not a criminal. Sometimes it is simply a witness. They sold certainty, the promise that a problem would vanish, and the buyer would never need to think about it again.
The men could work in daylight, then go home to ordinary life, and that separation is how brutality becomes sustainable. To prove a system, you need a location, a hub, and the lounge kept appearing in photos, notes, and whispers.
A hub explains scale, because if one place is trusted by criminals, it becomes a funnel where targets arrive voluntarily.
The hardest part was that the method produced absence, not scenes, and absence is difficult to present to a jury.
Only a limited number of victims could be firmly identified, and each identified name became a bridge to the larger unseen count.
Cooperation was not redemption, it was survival, and prosecutors used that survival instinct to extract structure from chaos.
In a group that shares guilt, the first person to speak turns everyone else into a potential defendant with a deadline. The most unsettling fact was location, not distance, because it was happening in a place that looked like a safe version of America. From here, the story becomes a collapse, arrests, testimony, partial truth, and the final twist that explains why the machine. By 1982, the disappearances stop feeling random and start feeling scheduled, like routine hidden inside the city.
The lounge stays open like any neighborhood bar, while the real business happens when the door is shut.
People arrive for deals, debts, introductions, and promises that sound normal when spoken in Brooklyn daylight. When someone stops answering calls, the city assumes they chose it, and the file stays thin.
That is how the operation survives. Not by brilliance, but by bureaucracy and low expectations.
Delmore adds another dot to his map and realizes the dots are clustering around one small pocket.
Across precinct lines, detectives see fragments, but no one sees the same story at the same time.
The strategy is separation. Separate dumps, separate jurisdictions, separate reports, and separate conclusions.
Federal surveillance keeps returning to the same address, collecting faces, plates, and timestamps outside that door.
Slowly, the task force suspects the lounge is not a meeting place. It is an endpoint. But endpoints are hard to prove when the victims cannot be named, and the evidence arrives in pieces. The crew chooses people on the margins, because their absence is easier for systems to ignore. Street-level crime creates constant smoke, and inside that smoke, larger crimes can move unseen.
Their power also comes from reputation, because fear completes the job before any hand is raised.
Fear moves faster than facts. especially when facts would implicate men who still look respectable.
The tapes keep rolling, and the language sounds like work orders rather than casual bar talk.
The code is simple in rhythm. A problem appears, then it gets handled, then the city goes quiet.
Above the crew sits a ladder of authority, where clean outcomes matter more than messy methods. Inside that ladder, DeMeo is valuable until he becomes a liability no one wants to carry.
Attention is the true enemy, because attention spreads from one man to everyone connected to him.
By late 1982, pressure rises from surveillance, internal politics, and a city drowning in unsolved cases. DeMeo senses the air changing as meetings shift, calls drop, and the usual routes go silent.
Paranoia becomes routine, and routine paranoia makes a man unpredictable to the people above him.
To the hierarchy, unpredictability is more dangerous than any rival crew on the street. So the conversation shifts from using DeMeo to removing DeMeo before he becomes a doorway. He tries to tighten control by testing loyalty, but the tests spread panic through the crew. Now each man faces grim math, silence and risk, or cooperation and survival.
Mutual guilt once protected them, but it also means everyone is trapped together.
And when a crew starts to fracture, the first weapon is not a gun, it is information. Men begin keeping private ledgers in their heads, preparing to trade details for time. At the same moment, investigators see alignment between disappearances, surveillance hits, and Delmore's notes. For the first time, separate systems overlap in a way that forms a single picture.
That picture points toward Flatlands and one small lounge that suddenly feels too central to ignore.
But moving too fast can collapse a case, and a collapsed case warns everyone inside.
So law enforcement waits, documents, listens, and hopes the crew makes a mistake on its own.
January 10th, 1983. A key figure is located in Brooklyn, and the network begins to collapse. The message is internal, because someone close arranged it, and someone powerful approved it.
When the leader falls, the machine does not keep running smoothly. It sputters and sheds parts.
Some try to continue quietly, but the protection network is gone, and risk multiplies overnight. Investigators notice movement, men changing habits, avoiding familiar places, and making careful, sudden trips.
One informant becomes the hinge that turns rumor into allegation, and allegation into a roadmap.
The roadmap describes a lounge, a back room, and a method built around making people disappear.
Prosecutors understand the limit. Stories alone are not enough unless they can be corroborated.
So they hunt for anchors, dates, meetings, vehicles, and witnesses who can confirm a single moment. Every confirmed moment becomes a pin, and enough pins create a case that can survive court.
Inside the crew, the question becomes simple. Who speaks first, and who goes down last?
Old rules promise silence, but old rules do not shorten a life sentence when evidence stacks up.
Some bargain, offering names and timelines, trying to buy years back with information.
In court, the crimes are presented as a system: recruitment, luring, killing, and disposal as routine.
Defense lawyers attack credibility because cooperating witnesses carry incentives that can distort memory.
The prosecution answers with overlap, multiple testimonies, matching details, and hard facts that align. Even then, the city's losses cannot be fully counted because many victims were never identified. Families file reports and wait years, living inside uncertainty that never fully resolves. That uncertainty becomes ambiguous loss, where hope and grief share the same space for decades.
In Flatlands, neighbors stare at the lounge as if the building itself changed shape overnight.
A familiar place becomes a warning, because normal doors can conceal abnormal work. The story spreads because it breaks a myth about what mass killing is supposed to look like.
It is not always one stranger. Sometimes it is a group treating violence like employment. Investigators are chilled by the clockwork calm, because routine is easier to hide than chaos.
Quiet streets can hide loud crimes when victims are isolated and institutions are overloaded.
Overload becomes cover, because attention goes to the loudest cases, not the most systematic ones.
The case forces agencies to share information that used to die inside separate precinct boundaries.
It also raises a question. How many disappearances were misread as choices, not crimes?
Every dismissal adds invisibility, and invisibility is the oxygen that keeps an operation alive.
The hierarchy that benefited tries to distance itself through silence, delays, and denials. Trials focus on what can be proven, not what might be true, leaving gaps that law cannot fill.
That gap is where estimates live. 75 confirmed, and many more suspected beyond proof.
For the public, numbers become headlines. For families, one missing name is a lifetime.
Some learn the truth years later, and confirmation feels devastating, but clarifying. Others never learn anything solid, and the absence becomes a permanent, unanswered question. Investigators confront the business logic, violence used to stabilize profits, disputes, and status.
In that logic, killing is not emotional. It is a tool chosen for efficiency.
Efficiency is the thread connecting the lounge, the crew, and the decade of disappearances. Repetition erases choice, because the same act done often stops feeling like a decision.
This is how men can live ordinary lives while committing extraordinary crimes in separate compartments. Work stays in one room, home stays in another, and conscience is never invited to either.
As convictions land, the legend grows, sometimes inflated, sometimes minimized, always debated.
But one fact remains. A local operation produced a citywide trail of missing people.
Delmer's instinct, federal tapes, and a rare overlap of investigations finally broke the loop.
Not one heroic moment, just paperwork, patience, and accidental alignment across time. Here is the twist. The system failed early because the system itself was fragmented by design.
They exploited that fragmentation. Separate precincts, separate dumps, separate victims, separate assumptions.
When fragments finally merged, the operation could no longer hide behind administrative distance.
By then, nearly a decade had passed, and the true count was beyond clean accounting.
The lounge becomes a symbol, but the deeper symbol is the method of disappearing people.
The most dangerous operations often look like routine business until the pattern is named.
A bar, a shop, a back room, a calendar, a crew, and a system that runs until interrupted.
Interruption came from betrayal inside the organization, not from mercy toward victims. That matters, because it shows what ends machines like this. Internal cost, not conscience. In the end, the crimes are prosecuted in pieces, just like the evidence arrived in pieces.
And Morgan. Some convictions stand as anchors, while other victims remain nameless and officially unresolved.
For law enforcement, the lesson is pattern recognition and information sharing across boundaries.
For the public, the lesson is caution. Familiar places can hide unfamiliar harm.
For families, the lesson is hardest. Closure is not guaranteed, even when a crew is exposed.
If you want one takeaway, it is this: disappearance is a strategy, not an accident.
The operation thrived because it was designed around institutional limits, not around human emotion. And it is repeatable wherever systems stay disconnected and assumptions stay unchallenged. This story is not told to glorify criminals. It is told to explain how the gaps were used. Because if you can name the gaps, you can close the gaps before the next pattern forms.
Final twist. The case cracked when unrelated lines of work overlapped by chance.
One body on ice, one wiretap on cars, and one detective's ledger pointed to the same door.
If those lines never met, the disappearances could have remained missing files and quiet grief.
If you want more cases like this, told step by step with the same calm voice, subscribe.
Next episode, we follow one missing person file that looked ordinary until the evidence surfaced years later. Until then, remember this: the most efficient crimes hide inside routines we stop questioning.